Some films are built on vision, others are built on disaster. Jaws was built on both, and its story is far stranger than most people realize. When Steven Spielberg took a gamble on a story about a killer shark terrorizing a quiet beach town, almost nothing went according to plan. The budget spiraled, the ocean refused to cooperate, and the film's most terrifying performer kept breaking down. Yet somehow, out of all that chaos, one of cinema's most influential movies found its shape. But the real story starts with the film's biggest star, and why it almost never appeared on screen at all. Number 1. The shark that wouldn't work. The most terrifying creature in cinema history could barely function. The mechanical shark built for the production was a remarkable piece of engineering, but the moment it entered saltwater, everything began to collapse. It would sink, jam, and seize up without warning, leaving the crew adrift at sea with an expensive machine that simply refused to do its job. The failures were so frequent that entire filming days were abandoned, while technicians scrambled to make repairs. Spielberg faced a decision that would define the entire production: continue fighting the machine or find a different way to tell the story. He chose a radical approach: hide the shark almost entirely. Instead of showing the creature, he built tension through what the audience couldn't see: a trailing dorsal fin, a barrel dragged beneath the surface, a stretch of open water that felt suddenly, horribly wrong. What could have been a professional disaster became the film's greatest creative strength. By keeping the shark hidden, Spielberg gave audiences' imaginations room to work, and what the mind conjures is often far more terrifying than what any camera can show. One of Hollywood's most celebrated thrillers was shaped not by ambition, but by a mechanical breakdown that nobody saw coming. Number 2. Bigger Boat was never scripted. Some of cinema's greatest moments are born not in a writer's room, but in the middle of a chaotic shoot. The line that became one of the most quoted in movie history, "You're gonna need a bigger boat," was never part of the screenplay. It grew out of a running joke among the crew, who had been dealing with constant logistical headaches throughout the troubled production. Whenever something went wrong, equipment that was too small, boats that weren't powerful enough, resources that kept falling short, someone on set would mutter a version of the phrase. Roy Scheider picked it up and, during a key scene alongside Robert Shaw, delivered it completely off script. The moment felt so natural, so perfectly timed, that Spielberg kept it exactly as filmed. No rewrites, no polish, just an actor's instinct meeting exactly the right moment. The line took on a life of its own long after the movie's release. It became shorthand in everyday conversation for any situation where someone realizes they are dramatically underprepared. The American Film Institute later ranked it among the most memorable lines in cinema history, a remarkable fate for something that was never written down at all. Number 3. The theme Spielberg first laughed at. It's hard to imagine the film without its music, but there was a moment when its composer's greatest contribution was almost dismissed entirely. When John Williams sat down at the piano and played the now legendary two-note theme for Spielberg, the director's first reaction was laughter. It seemed too simple, almost playful, and Spielberg initially assumed Williams was warming up before playing the real thing. Williams was completely serious. He explained that the relentless rhythmic pulse was designed to function like a heartbeat, something primal that audiences would feel before they consciously registered it. Slowly, Spielberg began to understand. The simplicity wasn't a weakness, it was the entire point. The theme could creep into a scene almost unnoticed and build dread with nothing more than two repeating notes growing louder and faster. The score went on to win the Academy Award for Best Original Score, and the theme became one of the most recognized pieces of film music ever written. More than a composition, it became a cultural reflex. Two notes that, even decades later, are enough to make people glance nervously at open water. Williams and Spielberg would go on to collaborate on dozens of projects, but this was the partnership's defining early moment. Number 4. Spielberg feared his career was over. Nobody watching the finished film would guess how close its director came to walking away convinced he had made a catastrophic mistake. As delays stretched from weeks into months and the mechanical shark continued to fail, Spielberg grew increasingly certain that the production was spiraling beyond recovery. He was a young director with a promising but still fragile career, and the fear that the movie could end it weighed on him constantly. The decision to shoot on the open ocean, rather than in a controlled studio tank, had seemed bold at first. In practice, it created problems that no amount of planning could have predicted. Weather, tides, boat traffic, and a malfunctioning animatronic combined to make every filming day a battle. Spielberg later admitted he would not have made the same call again, and that the experience taught him hard lessons about the limits of what any filmmaker can actually control. What makes the story remarkable is how completely those fears turned out to be wrong. The pressure forced creative choices that define the film's entire identity: hiding the shark, leaning into the chemistry between the three leads, and trusting the power of suggestion over spectacle. The movie that nearly broke him became the one that launched him into the upper ranks of Hollywood. and showed that the most uncertain productions can sometimes produce the most enduring results. Number 5. The shark was built in record time. Behind every mechanical failure on set was an origin story that began long before filming started. The full-scale, 25-foot animatronic shark had to be designed, built, and delivered on a timeline that gave engineers almost no room to properly test their work. The pressure to meet the production schedule meant that critical testing phases were shortened or skipped entirely. The team responsible for building the shark was essentially racing against a deadline from the very beginning. The design was ambitious, a pneumatic and hydraulic system capable of moving the creature's jaw, tail, and body convincingly in the water. But ambitious designs require time, and time was the one thing nobody had. When the shark was finally transported to Martha's Vineyard, it had never been properly tested in real saltwater conditions. The results were predictable in hindsight, but devastating in the moment. Saltwater corroded components, electronics failed, and the systems controlling the shark's movements became unreliable within days of shooting. The rushed build didn't just cause problems, it fundamentally shaped the entire film. Every creative workaround, every lingering shot of open water, every scene built on tension rather than spectacle traces back to decisions made under pressure long before the cameras ever started rolling. Number 6. Gregory Peck killed a funny scene. The original plan for introducing Quint was far more playful than what ended up on screen. Spielberg's early concept called for the character to be discovered in a movie theater, laughing uproariously at footage from the 1956 film Moby Dick, a scene that would have immediately established him as a man who found dark amusement in tales of sailors hunting legendary sea creatures. It was a clever idea, layered with irony that audiences familiar with the story would have appreciated immediately. The plan fell apart when Gregory Peck, who had starred in the Moby Dick adaptation, refused to allow footage from that film to be used. The reasons were never made entirely public, but the refusal was final. Spielberg was left without his opening gambit and had to find a new way to establish who Quint was and why the audience should pay attention to him. What replaced it was the blackboard scene. Quint dragging his fingernails across a chalkboard to silence a crowded room before delivering his pitch to hunt the shark. It became one of the film's most memorable character introductions, and it set a darker, more menacing tone than the original concept would have allowed. Losing the Moby Dick footage was a frustration at the time, but what replaced it turned out to be something far more powerful. Number 7. The perfect island for filming. Finding the right location for a film shot almost entirely at sea is no small challenge. Spielberg and his team needed a place with very specific qualities. Open water that looked genuinely vast, combined with shallow depths that would allow the mechanical shark rigs to be anchored and operated at a safe distance from shore. After scouting several options, one location stood out as uniquely suited to every requirement on the list. Martha's Vineyard off the coast of Massachusetts offered something almost impossible to find elsewhere: water that remained relatively shallow for a significant distance from the shoreline. This meant the crew could position the shark machinery far out in the ocean while still keeping it manageable to operate. From the camera's perspective, the setup created the illusion of deep open sea. Exactly the visual Spielberg needed to make the threat feel genuinely inescapable. The island community embraced the production in ways that went beyond simply providing a backdrop. Many local residents were hired as extras and crew members, and the shoot became woven into the island's identity in a way that lasted long after filming ended. Decades later, Martha's Vineyard still draws visitors who make the trip specifically because of its connection to the movie, a legacy that turned a practical location decision into something with a cultural life of its own. Number 8. The shoot that became flaws. When production began, the plan was straightforward: a 55-day shoot that would wrap on schedule and deliver the film on budget. What actually unfolded was something else entirely. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and filming kept rolling long past any reasonable endpoint. By the time cameras finally stopped, the shoot had stretched to approximately 159 days, nearly 3 times the original estimate. The budget followed the same trajectory. What had started as a manageable studio production grew into something far more expensive, as every delay added costs and every technical failure demanded a new solution. The final figure more than doubled before it was over, putting enormous pressure on everyone involved and testing the patience of the studio executives watching from a distance. The crew found a way to process the mounting chaos through humor. They began referring to the production by an informal nickname, Flaws, a pointed acknowledgement of everything that had gone wrong. It was the kind of dark joke that only makes sense when you're deep inside a disaster, and laughter is the only reasonable response. Remarkably, despite all of it, what emerged from those 159 days wasn't a cautionary tale, but one of the most celebrated films in Hollywood history. Number 9. The problem with the open ocean. Shooting on the open ocean sounds like a manageable logistical challenge. In practice, it became one of the defining ordeals of the entire production. Spielberg's vision required shots where the water stretched to the horizon without any land visible in the background. Images that would make the audience feel the true isolation of being far from shore with something dangerous lurking beneath the surface. Achieving that look proved far more difficult than anyone had anticipated. The waters around Martha's Vineyard are busy, and boats, sailboats, and other vessels had a persistent habit of drifting into the background of carefully composed shots at exactly the wrong moment. Every unwanted sail or hull that appeared on the horizon meant stopping everything and waiting for the frame to clear before filming could resume. The waiting accumulated into something genuinely punishing. Hours could pass between usable takes, not because of anything the cast or crew had done wrong, but simply because the ocean refused to stay empty. Weather added another layer of unpredictability, with conditions that looked perfect shifting within minutes, changing the light or stirring the water in ways that broke visual continuity between shots. The sea, it turned out, had no interest in cooperating with anyone's production schedule. Number 10. The three sharks named Bruce. On a set defined by mechanical failure and technical chaos, even the animatronic's nickname carried a story. The crew began calling their creation Bruce, a name that stuck throughout the production and has followed the shark into film history ever since. The origin was surprisingly mundane. It was reportedly borrowed from Spielberg's entertainment lawyer, a small inside joke that quietly became permanent. The reality of building Bruce was more complicated than a single shark. The production required multiple versions of the animatronic, each designed for specific types of shots and movements. One version was rigged for close-ups requiring jaw movement, another for side profiles, and others for different angles and action requirements. Each had its own technical limitations, which made scheduling their use a complex puzzle the crew had to solve on a daily basis. Despite becoming one of the most famous props in movie history, none of the original Bruce sharks survived in good condition. The animatronics deteriorated after production ended, and for decades, most of the original mechanical components were lost or discarded. One partially restored version eventually found a home in a museum, giving audiences a rare chance to see the creature up close, and perhaps appreciate just how much engineering and how much sheer improvisation went into making something so persistently broken become so enduringly iconic. Number 11. The Orca was built to sink. Quint's weathered fishing vessel, the Orca, is one of cinema's great supporting characters, a boat that feels as lived-in and dangerous as the man who commands it. What audiences didn't know while watching it creak and groan across the screen was that several versions of the vessel had been constructed specifically for different stages of the story. The production team built multiple iterations of the boat, each engineered to perform a particular function during filming. The most dramatic of these versions was designed with a very specific purpose in mind: to sink. For the film's climax, where the Orca is slowly dragged beneath the surface by the shark, a specially modified version of the boat was prepared that could be deliberately flooded and submerged on cue. Getting the sequence right required careful coordination between the crew operating the sinking mechanism and the actors performing on a deck that was genuinely going underwater. The result was one of the most visually striking finales in the film. Robert Shaw's performance during the Orca's destruction carries real weight, partly because the physical environment around him was genuinely shifting and filling with water. The sinking wasn't entirely simulated. It was a controlled version of something actually happening, and that reality gave the sequence an authenticity that would have been nearly impossible to fake. The boat that was built to sink ultimately helped make the film's ending something audiences have never forgotten. Number 12. Real sharks changed a key scene. Among all the improvisation and problem-solving that defined the production, one of the most remarkable pivots came from an encounter that nobody planned or scripted. Underwater cinematographers Ron and Valerie Taylor were hired to film real great white sharks off the coast of Australia, providing footage that would give the film genuine ocean floor authenticity. What happened during their shoot went well beyond anything the production had anticipated. A real great white became entangled in the steel cage equipment during filming. The shark's struggle with the cage was dramatic and completely unplanned. A raw, chaotic moment of a real creature behaving in ways no animatronic could have replicated. The footage was powerful enough to stop everyone in their tracks when they reviewed it. Rather than treating the incident as a complication, Spielberg recognized it as something far more valuable. The script was rewritten to incorporate what the cameras had accidentally captured. The cage sequence became one of the film's most intense set pieces, and its power comes directly from the fact that part of what audiences are watching is entirely real. The shark's movements, the way it fights against the metal frame, the visible force of an actual creature, none of that was manufactured. It stands as one of cinema's most striking examples of an unplanned moment becoming essential to the finished film. Number 13. The Indianapolis speechwriters. Few scenes in the film carry the emotional weight of Quint's monologue about the USS Indianapolis, a quiet, candlelit moment where the story beneath the story finally surfaces. The speech describes the real-life sinking of the naval vessel in 1945 and the days that followed, when hundreds of sailors were lost to shark attacks while awaiting rescue in open water. It transformed Quint from a gruff, colorful character into someone with genuine haunted depth. What many viewers don't realize is that the speech was the product of multiple hands working at different stages. The initial concept came from playwright Howard Sackler, who recognized the Indianapolis story as something that could give Quint a powerful backstory. Screenwriter John Milius, known for his muscular, intense prose, later expanded it into something more substantial. Robert Shaw, himself a novelist and playwright, took the material and reshaped it further, infusing it with the rhythms and silences that made the final delivery so affecting. The collaborative nature of the speech's creation is part of what makes it so layered. No single writer's fingerprints dominate the final version. Instead, it reads like something that evolved organically, finding its own weight over time. Shaw delivered it in a single long take after an earlier attempt was deemed too theatrical, pulling back into something quieter and more devastating. The result is widely regarded as one of the finest pieces of screen acting in American cinema. Number 14. The script was written at sea. Most films arrive on set with a finished screenplay. This production took a different approach, not entirely by choice. As filming got underway, it became clear that the original script needed constant adjustment to account for the realities of shooting in the open ocean. Screenwriter Carl Gottlieb was present throughout the shoot, writing and rewriting pages in real time as circumstances on the water demanded changes. Weather forced certain scenes to be restructured entirely. The mechanical shark's repeated failures meant sequences built around the creature had to be reconceived on the spot, often with Gottlieb producing new pages overnight for filming the following morning. What might have felt like a chaotic, unworkable situation actually produced something unexpected, dialogue, and scenes that felt genuinely spontaneous, because in many cases, they were. The chemistry between Roy Scheider, Richard Dreyfuss, and Robert Shaw developed during the shoot, and the script evolved around what they were naturally building together. The campfire scene aboard the Orca, where the three men drink and trade stories before the final confrontation, is perhaps the clearest product of this process. It has the texture of something discovered rather than constructed, a scene that breathes and lingers in ways that tightly scripted exchanges rarely do. The fact that the screenplay was still being shaped while cameras were rolling turned out to be less a weakness than an accidental gift. Number 15. Spielberg's hidden color trick. Great filmmaking often works on the audience without their awareness, shaping emotional responses through choices they never consciously register. One of the most deliberate of these decisions on this production was a color strategy that Spielberg embedded throughout the film from the very beginning. The directive was simple but precise. Keep red out of the frame wherever possible. Costumes, set dressing, and background details were all carefully considered with this principle in mind. By systematically removing red from the visual environment, Spielberg ensured that when blood did appear, in those sudden shocking moments that punctuate the film, it would hit the audience with maximum visual and psychological force. The eye, unaccustomed to that particular color, after long stretches of ocean blues and sandy neutrals, registers it as something alarming and wrong. The technique is a masterclass in visual restraint. Nobody sitting in a cinema would identify what the film was doing, but the effect registered in the body before the brain could process it. It also speaks to the level of deliberate craft running beneath a production that is often described primarily in terms of its chaos and improvisation. The truth is that both things were happening simultaneously, a movie being made under pressure, and a filmmaker thinking precisely and intelligently about every frame. Number 16. The famous Jaws effect shot. Cinema has a long history of borrowing techniques from its own past, and one of the most visually striking moments in this film traces directly back to a trick pioneered by Alfred Hitchcock nearly 2 decades earlier. The shot occurs on a crowded beach when Chief Brody suddenly realizes a shark attack is unfolding in front of him. In a single, disorienting movement, the world around him seems to both rush closer and pull away at the same time, a visual expression of pure, sudden panic. The technique is known as a dolly zoom, sometimes called the vertigo effect, after the 1958 Hitchcock film where it was most famously deployed. It works by simultaneously moving the camera toward the subject while adjusting the zoom lens in the opposite direction, or vice versa. The result is an image where the subject remains the same size in the frame while the background warps dramatically, creating a sensation of spatial wrongness that is deeply unsettling to watch. Spielberg's use of the shot on the beach was perfectly calibrated to the moment. What Brody sees in the water triggers a realization that changes everything, and the camera physically enacts that psychological rupture for the audience. It is the kind of filmmaking decision that reveals how deeply Spielberg understood the vocabulary of cinema even at that early stage of his career. Borrowing from a master, and deploying the technique with enough precision that it became associated with his own film just as much as its origin. The shot has since been replicated in countless films, cementing its place as one of cinema's most borrowed visual tools. Number 17. A jump scare shot in a pool. The moment when Ben Gardner's severed head appears through a hole in his submerged boat is one of the film's most effective shock moments, a sudden, silent eruption out of still water that has startled audiences for decades. What makes it particularly interesting is where it was actually filmed. The ocean had nothing to do with it. The sequence was shot in a backyard swimming pool. The pool belonged to editor Verna Fields, who became one of the production's most valuable collaborators. After the main shoot had wrapped, it was decided that the scene needed to hit harder, and that a reshoot in a controlled environment would give the crew far more precision than the open ocean ever could. The pool provided exactly that. Powdered milk was poured into the water to replicate the murky, greenish visibility of the ocean floor, turning an ordinary backyard into something genuinely eerie. The practical ingenuity behind the scene is a reminder of how much of effective filmmaking comes down to problem solving rather than resources. The most terrifying single image in the movie, a dead man's face appearing without warning in a confined space, was created with a swimming pool, a prosthetic head, and some dairy product. It also cemented Verna Fields' role as more than just an editor on the project. Her creative contributions, from the cutting room to her own backyard, were fundamental to the film's finished identity, and proof that the best solutions are often the simplest ones available. Number 18. Spielberg's hidden cameos. Directors leaving traces of themselves inside their own films is a tradition as old as cinema itself, and on this production, Spielberg indulged in several small, easy-to-miss appearances that reward careful viewers. Unlike the kind of visual cameo where an audience might spot a face in a crowd, most of his contributions here are buried in the soundtrack and the margins of the story rather than in plain sight. During the film's final act, an uncredited voice crackles over a radio. That voice belongs to Spielberg himself, a quiet insertion that most audiences have never noticed. He also contributed to certain minor musical elements layered into the film's audio design, adding another invisible fingerprint to the finished product. Perhaps the most charming of his hidden appearances came in the form of his own dogs, who were given small roles in background scenes, a deeply personal touch in a film otherwise defined by mechanical creatures and open water chaos. These small gestures speak to something real about the relationship a filmmaker develops with a project this demanding. After months of chaos, stress, and doubt, slipping pieces of your own life into the margins of the finished film becomes a way of marking the experience, of leaving a record that you were there, inside all of it, when everything felt like it might fall apart. The film belongs to its audiences now, but those hidden traces remain, small, quiet proof of just how personally Spielberg lived inside every frame. Number 19. The editing that built the terror. A film's power lives in many places: performance, photography, music. But for this particular movie, the editing suite may have been where the most decisive work happened. Verna Fields, the film's editor, faced an extraordinary challenge, constructing a coherent, terrifying thriller around a mechanical shark that frequently couldn't be shown. The creature's absence from the frame wasn't always an artistic choice. Sometimes, the footage simply didn't exist. Fields worked with remarkable precision to solve that problem. By controlling exactly how long the camera lingered on a reaction, or precisely when a sound effect landed against a cut, she shaped the audience's perception of danger, without ever needing to put the shark on screen. The rhythm of the editing became the film's nervous system, telling viewers when to tense up, when to exhale, and when to be caught completely off guard. Footage that should have felt incomplete instead felt deliberately, masterfully withheld. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences recognized what she had achieved. Fields won the Oscar for Best Film Editing, a result that pointed directly at how central her contribution had been to the film's identity. It is sometimes said that movies are made 3 times, once in the writing, once in the shooting, and once in the editing. For this film, the third act of that process was arguably the most important of all, and the woman who performed it ranks among the production's most essential creative forces. Without her work, the shark's absence would have felt like a flaw rather than a masterstroke. Number 20. The poster that sold the movie. Long before audiences sat down in a darkened theater, the image that would define the film had already found its way into public consciousness. The iconic poster, a massive shark rising vertically through dark water toward an unsuspecting swimmer at the surface, became one of the most immediately recognizable pieces of visual marketing in Hollywood history. Its power was instinctive and immediate, communicating the film's entire premise in a single glance. What many people don't know is that the image didn't originate with the movie at all. Artist Roger Castell created the illustration for the paperback edition of Peter Benchley's original novel, and when the studio began developing the film's marketing campaign, the decision was made to adapt that existing artwork rather than commission something new. The image had already connected with readers, and the studio recognized it as something worth building the entire campaign around. The choice turned out to be one of the smartest in the film's marketing history. In an era before digital advertising, a striking image reproduced across posters, newspaper ads, and promotional materials needed to work instantly at every size and in every context. This one did. The shark's upward trajectory and the swimmer's oblivious vulnerability communicated danger, scale, and helplessness all at once. A visual that required no explanation and left no room for doubt about what kind of film audiences were being invited to see. It remains a benchmark for how a single image can carry the full weight of a film's identity. Number 21. The ratings battle behind the film. By the time the film was ready for release, it had already survived a troubled production, a spiraling budget, and a mechanical shark that barely worked. What nobody had fully anticipated was the debate that would surround its classification. The film's content, sudden violence, genuine terror, and scenes of graphic injury prompted serious discussion about what rating it should carry and who should be permitted to see it. In the United States, the Motion Picture Association assigned the film a PG rating, a classification that surprised many who felt the material was far too intense for younger viewers. The controversy touched on a broader question about where the line between acceptable and excessive should be drawn in mainstream Hollywood cinema. Critics and parents alike questioned whether a film capable of triggering genuine trauma in adult audiences belonged in a category accessible to children. In the United Kingdom, the response was more restrictive. British censors assigned it an A certificate, which recommended parental guidance, though the details of regional classifications varied. The rating debate became part of the film's cultural story, a conversation about the power of cinema to disturb and unsettle that continued long after the initial release. It also contributed indirectly to the eventual creation of the PG-13 rating in the United States, as studios and regulators grappled with the growing gap between what PG and R were actually covering. The film had once again changed something far bigger than itself. Number 22. The TV ads that changed Hollywood. Before this film, the standard approach to launching a major movie was a gradual one. Limited early screenings, carefully placed print advertisements, and a slow build of word of mouth that would hopefully carry the film toward wider release. The strategy had worked for decades, and few in the industry saw any reason to abandon it. Then, Universal Pictures decided to try something different, and the movie business was never quite the same afterward. The studio invested heavily in television advertising, flooding major networks with commercials in the days leading up to the film's opening. Dozens of spots aired during prime time across multiple channels, reaching millions of households in a compressed window of time. The approach was expensive and unconventional, and not everyone inside the industry was convinced it would work. What it created was something that the old model rarely achieved: a genuine sense of national anticipation before a single ticket had been sold. The campaign's success rewrote the marketing playbook for Hollywood. Studios studying the film's performance recognized that television advertising could function as a detonator, something that created demand at scale and at speed in ways that print and publicity alone never could. The techniques pioneered for this release became standard practice across the industry within just a few years, and the logic behind them still drives major film marketing campaigns today. A movie about a shark quietly revolutionized the business of selling movies, and every summer, blockbuster that followed owes at least part of its launch strategy to what Universal dared to try in 1975. Number 23. The first modern blockbuster launch. The way a film reaches its audience matters almost as much as the film itself, and on this front, the release of Jaws marked a genuine turning point in Hollywood history. Prior to this moment, the dominant model for releasing a major film involved opening in a small number of prestige theaters, generating reviews and conversation, and gradually expanding to wider distribution as interest built. It was a patient strategy, and it rewarded patience. What Universal chose to do instead was release the film simultaneously across hundreds of cinemas nationwide on the same day. Paired with the saturation television advertising campaign already underway, this wide release turned the film's opening into a coordinated national event rather than a gradual rollout. Audiences across the country had access to it at the same moment, and the energy that created, the shared experience of everyone discovering it together, amplified the film's cultural impact enormously. The financial results made the strategy impossible to ignore. The film shattered box office records and demonstrated beyond any doubt that a wide release backed by aggressive advertising could generate returns that the older models simply couldn't match. Hollywood took careful note. Within a few years, the simultaneous wide release became the standard approach for major studio films, a structure that dominates the industry to this day. The modern blockbuster era, with all its opening weekend spectacle and marketing campaigns, traces its origins directly to the summer of 1975. A season that was changed forever by a story about a small beach town with a very big problem. Number 24. From movie to cultural landmark. There is a significant difference between a film that is widely seen and a film that is formally recognized as part of a nation's cultural heritage. Most movies, however successful, never cross that threshold. The process of achieving that status takes time, institutional support, and a demonstrated influence that outlasts the moment of release. Decades after its debut, this film completed that journey. Jaws was selected for preservation in the United States National Film Registry by the Library of Congress, a designation reserved for films deemed culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. The selection placed it alongside a relatively small number of works considered essential to the American cinematic record. Museums, universities, and film institutions began treating it not merely as a successful thriller, but as a primary text, something to be studied, preserved, and taught to future generations of filmmakers and critics alike. The academic and institutional attention brought new dimensions to a film that had always been discussed primarily in terms of its entertainment value and its impact on the industry. Scholars examined its editing, its score, its use of suggestion over spectacle, and its transformation of the summer release window into something commercially dominant. What had begun as a chaotic, nearly disastrous production became a case study in accidental genius, proof that the most enduring works of cinema are sometimes the ones that survived the most improbable journeys to reach the screen. Its place in the cultural record now feels not just deserved, but inevitable. Number 25. The unexpected legacy for sharks. No amount of box office success or critical recognition could have prepared anyone involved in the production for the most far-reaching consequence of the film's release. What Jaws did to public perception of sharks was immediate, widespread, and deeply damaging in ways that took decades to fully understand. Audiences left theaters not just frightened by a movie, but carrying a visceral, lasting fear of the ocean and everything beneath its surface. The cultural impact translated directly into real-world behavior. Reports of shark sightings triggered panic responses that would not have existed before the film. Fishing communities saw increased pressure to hunt and cull shark populations, and public sympathy for shark conservation efforts was minimal in an environment where the creatures had been so effectively coded as pure predators. The numbers of certain shark species declined sharply in the years following the film's release, a consequence nobody on set had imagined when they were fighting with a malfunctioning animatronic off the coast of Martha's Vineyard. What gives the legacy its particular weight is the regret that followed. Peter Benchley, who wrote the original novel, spent much of his later life advocating for shark conservation and publicly acknowledging the harm his story had caused. Spielberg echoed similar sentiments, expressing genuine sorrow over the film's effect on how the public viewed and treated the animals. The creature that made them both famous became a cause they felt obligated to defend. It is perhaps the most unexpected final chapter in a production full of unexpected chapters, a film that set out to thrill audiences and ended up reshaping humanity's relationship with an entire species. That unintended consequence may be the most enduring legacy of all. What began as a nightmare production, a broken shark, a doubled budget, and a director convinced he was watching his career collapse became the film that rewired Hollywood from the inside out. Jaws didn't just terrify audiences, it changed how movies are scored, edited, marketed, and released. Nearly every summer blockbuster that followed owes something to the chaos that unfolded off the coast of Martha's Vineyard in 1974. The secrets hidden inside this film are a reminder that greatness rarely arrives on schedule or on budget. The shark that wouldn't work, the script that was written at sea, the jump scare filmed in a backyard pool. None of it was planned, and all of it was essential. Sometimes the most enduring films are the ones that survived the most impossible roads to reach the screen. If you enjoyed diving into the hidden story behind one of cinema's greatest landmarks, hit like and subscribe so you never miss another Secrets video. And let us know in the comments, which of these behind-the-scenes secrets surprised you the most?